bring on Matt. Hi, Matt.
Hey, buddy. How you going?
I'm good, mate. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good.
Now, Matt,
It'll be my first sort of talk, I guess. So
it'll be good. So Matt actually came to me and wanted some advice on how to run it. So if anything goes wrong, you can actually blame me entirely. So
we will anyway.
I mean, yeah, that's fine. Matt's going to talk to us about intro to threat modeling. I think this will be a really good talk. It's a thing that I'm really passionate about, at least in terms of threat intel and my background. Shanna's been doing a lot of it as well. So, Matt, we will hand it over to you, and you'll do a great job.
Awesome, thank you. Hey, yeah. So this is an intro to threat modeling. Some slight stuff about me for a sec. Matt Belvedere, penetration tester for quite some time now. I've been hacking stuff before then. I worked at a fairly large pen test shop, or a pile of them you may have heard of. Then worked at a larger one that will sponsor sport events, not naming it. Now I'm at my own shop, which is kind of nice, but all the same, I think you've heard enough about those sorts of talks today. So before we begin, I want to go to a simple example of a threat model, or just something sort of weird. So that's me, and that is a cheetah. And about a second before that photo was taken, the thing growled at me, and I shat myself, which is why I'm looking like that. I'll come back to this as an example for something, but it's kind of weird. But anyway, we're talking about an introduction to threat modeling, sort of what is a threat model and how we do threat modeling. So we talk about assets and threats and likelihoods and bonus points and mitigations and the actors sort of involved. But mostly I wanted to talk about applying to an offensive context. I don't really want to go into the N different methods of formal threat modeling in the sense of if you're not Pastor or Stride or Dread or Persona non grata are. Talk's probably not really aimed at that. Formal mechanisms have their strengths and weaknesses. That is to say, consider them, but I don't really want to do that to this now. I've got 30 minutes, so this is sort of just like a very, very high level overview. So threat modeling. Formally, threat modeling is a process of which potential threats such as structural vulnerabilities, the absence of appropriate safeguards can be identified and enumerated and countermeasures prioritized. Just sort of like a very Microsofty 2005-ish view of it. But that's very wordy. But ultimately, threat modeling, you should be thinking about your system. You should be thinking of bad things that could happen to it, how we make those things not happen. It's sort of an order of likelihood and prioritizing things. You don't really have that many resources to fix things. Mostly so you can actually figure out what you want to spend your time fixing, and bonus points of figuring out if fixes actually work, or thinking about who actually wants to make these bad things happen. But we're talking about for offensive purposes. So we are the bad guy. We want to make those bad things happen, and what things we prioritize. That photo over there is to sort of get us in the right mindset, which is of the Emotet police raid for a ransomware gang, which happened quite some time ago. But they're the bad guys, so here we are. Why? Well, not so much like why the crime or why that works, but why you perform threat modeling. From a defensive point of view, design teams can sort of define their security boundaries ahead of time. Engineering teams can go through their secure by design lifecycle to various effects, and pen testing sort of being a defensive role, ultimately thinking of the likely threats of a system and then emulating them. For offensive threat modeling, let's say you're the ransomware actor. You want to figure out if your tooling's going to get you raided, much like these guys were. Figure out if your tradecraft's actually going to flag on every MDR, XDR, whatever. You want to understand what your targets are actually using, what processes they have for your surprise clients. In good red teams, pen test, threat emulation, all that sort of stuff, they are putting themselves in the shoes of offensive methodologies. Your system. What is your system? So ultimately, you're trying to figure out what you're trying to protect. You're trying to figure out what your crown jewels are. You're trying to figure out what tech stack it uses, where does it sit, where is it hosted. You're caring about who uses it. That's who are your end users, who are your internal users, who are your business-to-business users, all the sort of things that are relevant to that. What happens if it doesn't work properly? So in the case of an e-commerce system, what happens if it applies discounts incorrectly and now everyone gets a discount? Or what happens if it doesn't work at all in the case of a large Australian telco? You can kind of model these things fairly trivially with a sort of data flow diagrams. You care about entry points and exit points and how things flow ultimately for a system. Even a napkin sort of based data flow diagram, incredibly useful. In this, we've got a very simple diagram of a web app that lets you upload cat pictures and view cat pictures, and admin deletes them. So you've got two actors here, and you've got a database and all the stuff you'd expect for a typical web app. And we've got a rough idea of what trust boundaries are for this sort of a system. So there's considerations around if it should be an explicit or an implicit boundary. Have you defined it as a boundary? Is there anything enforcing it, or is it unenforceable boundaries? We'll go into that later. And sort of going into system behaviors / intended states. So your applications or systems could do some weird stuff. Have you considered what happens if you use them weirdly? Intended states, sort of intended finite state machine. If you've read that paper, it's pretty cool. But ultimately, is there functions you could abuse or use in various ways? Read that paper; it's good. It's all the same. Let's talk about threats. A threat is a bad thing that could happen. Under full methodologies would describe these things as, like in the STRIDE methodology at least, you describe it as spoofing or tampering or repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, or elevation of privilege. But really, let's make it practical. So web apps, you've got your XSS, you've got deserialization issues, all those sorts of things. One of the more interesting threats recently has been the LDMA library that's happened. It probably wasn't on people's bingo cards, but all the same. Supply chain issues aren't new, but are you considering these things in your threat model all the same? Other bits. Your threat modeling should include ideas of who would want to fiddle with your systems. Have you considered what sort of people or groups that could be? And they might operate with very different parameters to what you're used to. So that's to say that you could be dealing with someone who doesn't really care if they're caught, because what are you going to do about it? You should be considering if there's prior work against similar systems that you have. So let's say you're a development shop. If you're using certain frameworks that are riddled with, let's say, deserialization vulns like struts, that's worth considering into your modeling when you're approaching a system. And any prior work for your organization. So ultimately, things are built by people. Like, have there been similar issues before that you should be considering for your modeling? Prioritization. None of this should be terribly scarily new. People are probably using CVSS for a while now. There are pros and cons of that sort of a system or risk matrices. Ultimately, you sort of need to prioritize things in a way where you can figure out what you're going to fix, but your mileage may vary. Let's go through some scenarios. So, QR codes. Got some QR codes. Let's talk about a simple threat model for these things. Like, we've got QR codes. They let you not have to type out a bunch of long URLs to browse stuff. They can also let you launch intents and do other things like that. What can go wrong with these things? Again, like very simple napkin sort of write-up of, it could take you to a malicious website, or it could show you box. And how do you do that? You have a link to a phishing site, or you have an OA and a QR code parser, or you have, I don't know, you launch an intent on Android and do something funny. If we just model this in an attack tree, very simplistic one, like normally you'd chain these things, but we've sort of got like a dodgy QR code. We can take it across to a few different things, like phishing or sort of dodgy tracking, or just sort of exploiting an end user device. Big cat experience though. So going back to the very first picture, and a threat model for that. Ultimately, that was a experience at a local zoo, or local to me at least. The cat basically just sits there and doesn't eat you, hopefully. You hang out with the thing, and the zookeeper takes some photos of you, and you might pat it. But of course, that can go wrong, where it decides to ruin your day. It's got big teeth and big claws, and fairly simple again, but realistically, that could lead to a bad time. When threat modeling, you should be considering threat intelligence, or at least other data that can help you shape what likely threats could happen. Applying scrutiny is fairly important, though. I've got a screenshot of a quick Google search saying that there's no documented records of a wild cheetah killing a human. There's a handful of problems with that, but all the same, be careful of what you're ingesting when considering what you should be using to shape your likely threats for a system. But realistically, did I overlook some stuff? Well, the cheetah was scary, but realistically, the zookeeper had someone's unlocked phone. Wasn't mine, so that was good. Well, they could just feed you a cheetah and make it look like an accident. Not pictured that there's a dog in that they use to keep the cheetah company. Like they basically get like a Labrador and then a cheetah when they're young, and they put them together and they're friends for life. And the dog keeps the cheetah fine. The dog keeps the cheetah sort of in line. However, dogs can be unfriendly. It's probably more likely than me getting eaten by the cheetah or falling over in the dirt and getting injured. And like as a side note, turns out that's actually fairly likely. So perhaps worrying about the cheetah biting our face off wasn't really a realistic threat. Again, we're thinking about what attackers are likely to do. We don't have infinite resources, so prioritizations are important. But picking the wrong sort of sampling can lead to very weird scenarios where you're not picking a scenario which could be likely, or not emulating something which is likely to happen, or maybe the likelihood isn't too relevant, but it still happens and you still get shelled. I think in computers though. Let's talk about a very simple sort of data flow diagram for a website that sells widgets. We could talk about that. It's, you've got widget purchases, so people who buy widgets, and then there's a warehouse where the widgets are stored, and there's warehouse workers that do things, and there's an admin that ultimately fixes orders when they break. And we've got an idea of the processes here in little circles. But this can go wrong because we've got some ideas of trust boundaries. So realistically, did we consider that you could actually hit the front end without hitting Cloudflare because there was no control in place? Did we consider that an attacker could abuse the LZMA SSH backdoor and just hit our servers directly because of no firewalls and supply chain issues? Or did we consider the warehouse worker actually, via broken access controls, can actually just hit the database directly and do dodgy orders? Sort of putting it all together though. Data flow diagrams, pretty simple, will help you out a bunch. Attack trees, which we sort of went into for a split second, draw what can happen and how it changes together, but ultimately just have adversarial thinking in mind and put yourself in the proverbial ransomware den when you're thinking about these things. Threat modeling, just start small. Seriously, just get a whiteboard, get some people, draw it out, map some entry and exit points, figure out what can go wrong, and just think adversarially. Formalizing this sort of thing, show stacks 4 question frames, pretty handy. Like look into Stride, Pastor, and Persona non grata, know what they are and why to ignore them, or if you don't want to ignore them, why you're not ignoring them. But really, it is okay to just stick with attack graphs or dot points of what can go wrong. But for me, like Beers, Whiteboard, and some other adversarial people, really just works without wonders. But ultimately, that was my talk. It's pretty quick, pretty sweet, and I think we can get some of our day back. So, congrats. Thanks again.
That's okay.
Speak on 100%.
That was a very quick but very detailed introduction, I think. Question though, has the cat stolen your dinner? Were you attacked?
I did, actually.
The cheetah or the actual cat?
I meant the cat.
Oh no, the actual cat. No, the bloody thing stole my dinner. So ironically, I was writing this. That's only last night. I was writing the body slides up and the thing. Yeah, it sucked. So again, picking what threat intel to go with or picking what scenarios to go with are very important. As I'm thinking of sort of silly things a cheetah could do, the cat was stealing my dinner. So mileage may vary.
That's quite funny. It's the whole the one that always quite interesting to me is the difference between writing your password on a post-it note on your home computer versus like somebody that's going to be able to get it. Like somebody who breaks into your house is not going to try and steal your password and steal your money off your account. They're going to be stealing your computer itself and then selling your computer. So the threat models there are completely different. Which is why everybody says, you must always not put your password down somewhere.
I definitely like your analogies. And in 2019, I went over to New Orleans and did a talk at B-Sides New Orleans on threat modeling down under, which was in a similar kind of way because people think threat modeling is super complicated. Like you say, it's like dread and pasta. Is it dread, stead, whatever?
Yeah, you've got dread and stride and pasta and TNT,
That's it.
and then there's about 15 other things. But like, yeah.
And it just, you look at it and you start going, wow, my spreadsheet's going to be 16 like pages long, and I don't even know where to start. So trying to get people to look at threat modeling from a more simplified perspective, you know, at a minimum, what is the biggest threat to your organization? You know, and if it is AWS going down, threat model that. You know, how could this happen? What's going to happen? You know, make it really simple. But my talk in B-Side to New Orleans was a little bit playing on the fact that, you know, Americans are scared of Australia. So I talked about, you know, how we check our shoes before we put them on, particularly if they've been outside. Or for I've got horses, so for my gum boots and my riding boots, I actually put pantyhose over the top so that nothing can crawl in there. Right? So, I mean, you could use a sock, but pantyhose are just because they're, you know, stretchy, right? So you could use anything to put over the top. And magpies, you know, how we handle magpie mating season, either by having the little things on our helmets and stuff. So I was like looking at, we actually do threat modeling in our daily lives all the time. It's not that scary. We're just, you know, used to, you know, sometimes thinking about cyber threat modeling just seems like, wow, I don't know who our threat actors are and all that. You don't need all of that. It can be super, super simple, and starting off simple is the best way to go about it. So thank you.
Sorry, I have to ask, when you were doing threat modeling down under, did it include the bush?
Boomtish, where's the spicy
I'm
emoji?
sorry.
Surely that's a six chili spicy remark. Yeah.
Okay. There we go. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much, Matt. That was a great first presentation.
Thank you, Matt.
Much from you in the future.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
No worries. So